One of the questions I hear most often from practice owners is, what's the multiple for a dental practice? It's a fair question. In fact, it's probably one of the most common questions I hear. But I found that actually it's the wrong place to start. The better question to ask is, what's my normalized EBITDA? Because without understanding that first, the multiple really doesn't tell us very much. Over the last 8 years, I've worked with more than 350 healthcare practice owners, and I found that multiples are probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in business valuation. Dentists and physicians hear terms like 5 times EBITDA, 7 times EBITDA, my colleague sold for 8 times, but many owners aren't completely sure what those numbers actually mean. And that's understandable. They're experts in dentistry. They're experts at medicine, not business valuation. They're used to being the expert in the room. So today I'd like to explain multiples in plain English, what they are, why buyers use them, what influences them, and perhaps most importantly, why focusing only on the multiple can actually lead owners to the wrong conclusions. The good news is that a multiple is actually a pretty simple concept. It's simply a number that's applied to the earnings of a business to estimate its value. The equation itself is straightforward. Enterprise value equals normalized EBITDA multiplied by an appropriate market multiple. Let's use a simple example. Imagine a practice with normalized EBITDA of $1 million. If buyers determine that 5 times EBITDA is appropriate, that practice may be worth approximately $5 million. If the same EBITDA receives a 7 multiple, the value becomes approximately $7 million. Same earnings, different multiple, $2 million apart. And yet nothing changed except the multiple. That's why people become so interested in multiples. But here's the important part. The multiple is only one piece of the equation. If your normalized EBITDA isn't accurate, then multiplying it by any number still produces the wrong answer. That's one of the reasons I spend so much time helping owners understand their normalized EBITDA before we ever begin talking about multiples. This is where things become much more interesting. Many people assume there's simply a chart somewhere that says dental practices receive 6 times EBITDA. It really doesn't work that way. There are certainly market ranges, but there are also many factors that influence where a particular practice falls within that range. One factor is geography. Some markets are simply more attractive to buyers than others. A growing metropolitan area may attract a different level of buyer interest than a small rural market. That doesn't mean one practice is better. It simply means the demand may be different. Another factor is specialty. A buyer looking specifically for oral surgery, for example, may be willing to pay differently than the same buyer looking for a general dental practice. It doesn't necessarily mean one practice is better. It simply means that one buyer may see more opportunity in one over another. Another factor is competition. If multiple buyers are interested in the same practice, then naturally that creates a different negotiating environment than only when one buyer is involved. Another factor that can influence multiples is the overall economic environment. Interest rates are a good example. Many acquisitions are financed. When borrowing becomes more expensive, buyers often become more selective. That can influence the multiples being paid across the entire market. That's one reason it's difficult to compare a transaction completed several years ago with one that's happening today. Market conditions change, capital markets change, buyer demand changes. That's simply part of the business cycle. One of the biggest misconceptions I hear is, my friend sold for 8 times EBITDA. That sounds impressive, but unless the two practices being compared are truly comparable, that number doesn't really tell us very much. Were the practices similar in size? Did they have similar profitability? Was the owner staying after closing? Was the real estate included? Were there earnouts? Was there seller financing? Were several buyers competing? Without understanding all of those details, the multiple itself doesn't really tell much of the story. It's a little like hearing that your neighbor sold their house for $1 million. That doesn't automatically mean your house is also worth $1 million. Maybe your neighbor renovated the kitchen. Maybe they replaced the roof. Maybe they have a beautiful water view. Businesses work much of the same way. The market provides a starting point, but every business has characteristics that influence value. Let me give you a real example from my own experience. I've worked with practice owners who were convinced their practice should receive the same multiple as someone they knew. But once we dug into the details, the situations were completely different. One practice had multiple associates, stronger profitability, and very little owner dependence. The other relied almost entirely on the owner. On the surface, they looked similar, but from a buyer's perspective, they were very different businesses. One thing I think is really important to understand is this: buyers aren't purchasing your past, they're purchasing your future earnings. They're trying to determine what the practice is likely to earn after they become the owner. That's why buyers spend so much time evaluating normalized EBITDA. They're asking themselves, what earnings will actually transfer to us after the transaction closes? Another question I hear is, can I increase my multiple? When owners ask me that question, I usually smile because I know we're about to have a much more meaningful conversation. We stop talking about the multiple and start talking about the business. That's where the real opportunity is. A better question to be asked is, how can I build a stronger business? Because that's what buyers reward: improving profitability, maintaining clean financial records, building systems that aren't entirely dependent on one individual, developing a strong leadership team, retaining great employees, maintaining consistent financial performance. Those are things you actually have control over. All of those things reduce perceived risk. And when buyers perceive less risk, they're often willing to pay more for every dollar of EBITDA. Here's another point that doesn't get discussed very often. Business transactions are still about people. I've always told my clients, put your best foot forward throughout the entire process. Once you're in discussions with a buyer, that buyer may ask the same question more than one time. Don't become frustrated. Answer it professionally every time. Every conversation contributes to the buyer's overall impression of you and your practice. Sometimes the relationship itself becomes one of the many factors that help a transaction move successfully towards closing. If there's one thing I'd like you to remember from today's video, it's this: don't become fixated on the multiple. Become focused on understanding your normalized EBITDA and the factors that influence value. The multiple is important, but it's not the starting point. The better you understand your business before entering conversations with buyers, the stronger your position becomes. Knowledge creates confidence, and confidence leads to better decisions. My goal isn't to help owners chase a higher multiple. My goal is to help them build a stronger business. When you do that, the valuation often reflects the strength of the business you have built. Remember, the next time someone asks, what's the multiple for a dental practice? I hope you'll remember that the most important question really is, what's my practice actually worth and why? If you're thinking about selling your practice, whether that's now, next year, or several years from now, I encourage you to begin by understanding your normalized EBITDA. An independent valuation doesn't simply tell you what your practice may be worth today, it helps you understand why. It identifies opportunities to strengthen value, and it gives you confidence long before important negotiations begin. If you found this video helpful, I'd love it if you subscribe to the channel. And if there's another valuation topic you'd like me to cover, please leave it in the comments below. In my next video, we'll walk through what actually happens during a professional business valuation, from the initial financial analysis all the way to the final product. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.